Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, this is week 118 of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the last week of May 2024. In today's podcast, a Russian offensive campaign in Kharkiv was stopped. Russians have not been able to achieve much. We're going to talk about the last week was a very good week for Ukraine because Germany and the US allowed to strike Russian territory with its weapons. And we're gonna talk about a new stage of the Russian Ukrainian war because Russia started losing its advantages due to several reasons. So the Russians advance about 10 kilometers or 6 miles to the Kharkiv region, largely thanks to air superiority, and they cannot go any further. First of all, Ukrainian troops managed to build a very dense defense in the Kharkiv region. The top Ukrainian commanders understand the situation, know the problem, and gave adequate orders that make it possible in advance, so to speak, to stop any danger concerning the Ukrainian troops. In general, the bottom line is that now Ukraine has built a good line of defense, and Russian losses in the Kharkiv region have begun to increase very significantly. Russian logistics chains were also broken. The infantry remained on the battlefield without ammunition, equipment, food, water, and the equipment, and they started running out of equipment and the fuel. The offensive actually stopped, and in some places even began to roll back. Putin had very high hopes for this offensive. The Russians were planning a quick breakthrough to Kharkiv, encirclement of, or at least semi encirclement of the city, followed by squeezing out all its population. In a word, they wanted to depopulate Kharkiv, make it just an empty city so there would be no one except a handful of soldiers. Unfortunately for the Russians, it didn't work, and the Russians themselves are now being pushed back to the Russian territory. Russia didn't gain much, and instead, the Russian troops just lost lots of people and lots of equipment. But the invaders couldn't achieve their main goal due to the and to semicircle the Kharkiv because those plans were poorly planned. All they actually achieved is the capture of several Ukrainian villages, but the Russian soldiers stationed there are constantly being hit by Western HIMARS and Ukrainian howitzers. Putin will likely tell his population that the capturing of those couple of villages is a huge victory for Russia, but people will doubt that, given the huge losses they suffered and the huge number of coffins going back to Russia. One of the popular Russian Z bloggers wrote, quoting one man who reported from the front lines: "Only in front of my eyes, in just 2 days, we lost 200 unexperienced soldiers that were just recently recruited and poorly equipped was thrown into the battle." I will say more. Our our raged regiment, which had over 1,200 soldiers, of whom about 250 active soldiers left alive. And we know we are pushed to go on assault again. The task is to attack Ukrainian positions again and again. We all know we will we will all be dead within several hours. I would say there is a new stage of the Russian Ukrainian war. I would even say that this is a page from which the strategic defeat of the Russian Federation might begin. So, the main topic today is, of course, that the American and with them all other Western countries have finally begun to gradually lift the ban on the use of their weapons on the Russian territory. Previously, as you know, they only allowed the use of these weapons on the targets in the occupied Ukrainian territories. So several Western mass media immediately reported that in the coming hours or days, missiles might be fired at targets in the Russian territory. Actually, preparations are now underway to launch these strikes because the US and allies already delivered all the weapons. All the Ukrainians were waiting for is just for a new permission to strike the Russian divisions and the Russian warehouses in the Russian territory where we're preparing to new assaults on the Ukrainian territory. It seems that Russia has reached the peak of what it could achieve, so to speak, power and size of Ukrainian territories. It was the spring of 2024. Then it will roll down little by little. Actually, this is my personal feeling based on observing everything that happens and has happened in the last few weeks. Right up to the Western allies lifted all the restrictions, the former president and the closest ally of Putin, Dmitry Medvedev, which is, as you remember, the former president of the Russian Federation, said that in response to strike by Western weapons on targets inside the Russian Federation, Moscow would launch a nuclear strike on the one of the NATO countries with no strategic nuclear weapons. Again, it sounds like another bluff by the Russian terrorists. These nuclear threats are now nothing new for the whole world. This sharp increase in escalation of Russian rhetoric regarding these strikes is very interesting. They understand that as soon as Ukraine started bombing the same airfields or headquarters or warehouses full of weapons or some railway junctions on the territory of the Russian Federation, then Moscow will simply not be able to fight back and will start to really lose the war. With the new weapons delivered to Ukraine and the removal of restrictions, Russia started to loosen its initiative on the battlefield, slowly but steadily. In recent weeks, Ukraine accelerated its program of strategic strikes against Russia. A strategic strike campaign must reduce the country's ability to wage war and influence the strategic decision making of the enemy's command and its chief advisors. It can include military, economic, informational, social, and diplomatic goals. Having started the war without the possibility of launching strategic strikes, the Ukrainians created a powerful targeting and striking complex, which began in 2023 with numerous drone attacks on Moscow and attacks on Russian air bases in the depth of Russia, including one that destroyed a Tu-22M3 supersonic long-range bomber at the military Soltsy 2 air base. The Ukrainians also carried out several attacks on the Kerch Bridge, if you remember. These strikes are political rather than military in nature and are aimed at putting pressure on Putin in front of the Russian people and making him answer for why he cannot defend Russia. During the latest Ukrainian attacks on May 17th, if you remember, more than 100 drones struck numerous targets in Russia and Crimea, including energy and military facilities. This indicates the increasing improvement of Ukrainian targeting and strike operations. Ukraine is also campaigning against Russian oil refinery and export infrastructure. This affects the Russian energy sector. However, whether this can have a decisive impact on the Russian economy and change Putin's war calculations remain to be seen. So, the window of opportunity for Russia is gradually closing. Seems like Ukraine steps up the game. Ukraine is conducting an operational strike campaign. The goal of the campaign should be to disrupt the coherence and unity of actions of numerous tactical operations in the theater of war. It should also reduce the ability to conduct future large scale air, land, and sea campaigns. The targets are headquarters and means of communication, operational logistics, reserves of forces that are not yet engaged or not assigned to specific combat operations, fire equipment, and air defense equipment. Ukraine operational strike campaign aims to weaken Russian combat power in the south and east. The campaign uses long-range missiles including Storm Shadow and Scalp air-launched missiles and naval drones. The targets of this campaign are Russian warehouses of technical means, weapons, Crimean military facilities, headquarters, and necessary transport hubs. As you all notice, attacks by Ukrainians in Crimea have increased in recent weeks. These include the recent attacks on Baalbek Air Base, where Ukrainians destroyed aircraft and airbase infrastructure, as well as other attacks on radars and air defense facilities in Crimea Peninsula. As noted in a recent British intelligence assessment, these attacks on Crimea weakened Russian air defense over Crimea. They had a domino effect on other Russian Air Force and air defense operations in general. These attacks pursue three main goals: to reduce Russia's ability to use Crimea as a launch site for missiles and drones. Another one, disrupt the supply lines that deliver fuel, ammunition, and other types of supplies to the battlefield in southern Ukraine. Weaken the Russian fleet operating in the region to reduce pressure on Ukrainian operations in the Black Sea, such as grain exports. Offensive naval strikes are provided by a constantly evolving fleet of naval strike drones developed and deployed by Ukraine very successfully in the last 2 years. New generations of submersible and stealth drones are used for naval attacks, which in fact made the western part of the Black Sea and the fleet base in Sevastopol unusable for the Russians. The covered shore site is a great source of information on this growing fleet of semi-submersible Ukrainian attack drones. One element of an operational strike campaign that might need improvements in operations to seek, strikes, and destroy Russian combat formations, headquarters, firepower, and logistics that have been yet entered combat. Destroying these second and third echelon forces before they can engage in combat against the Ukrainians should be a top priority. Ukrainian forces are already fighting under conditions of shortage of manpower and firepower. A more active operational strike campaign should be aimed at redressing this disparity, even if it comes at the expense of the striking but perhaps less effective strategic strike campaign conducted by the Ukrainian Special Services and other units of Ukraine armed forces against the targets deep in Russia. So, these all improvements on the battlefield are actually started to open up for Ukraine. Why? Because the West finally allowed Ukraine to use its weapons on the territory of Russia. Ukraine has been asking for this permission for a very long time because what actually happens on the battlefield right across the border on the in the Russian villages next to Ukrainian border, the Russians accumulated lots of forces and preparing for the next strikes, and Ukraine drones can clearly see that. But without the permission to strike those units, we cannot stop the enemy. So, President Joe Biden has finally given permission to Ukraine to strike inside Russian territory with American munitions, though he has restricted their use so Kiev can only hit targets over the border close to Kharkiv. after Russia made significant advances around the city in the northeastern part of the country, close to the Russian border. The president recently directed his team to ensure that Ukraine can use US supplied weapons for counterfire purposes in Kharkiv, so Ukraine can hit back at Russian forces hitting them or preparing to hit them. The loosening of these restrictions marks a break from long standing policy amid growing international pressure from close US allies. But it is limited to the area around Kharkiv, and Ukraine has not requested permission beyond that, the US official said. So Germany also finally allowed Ukraine to use its weapons on the territory of Russia. As early as May 26, Olaf Scholz stated that he was against, even on May 26, Olaf Scholz was against this permission because he wanted to prevent the conflict from developing into a third war. And already a few days ago, he stressed that Ukraine has every opportunity, according to the international law, to do what it's doing. I strongly suspect that this is probably the result of Scholz's meeting with President of France Emmanuel Macron, who has a different approach. And apparently, now this use of German French relations is very important for Germany and for European Union. And Macron went too far in his statements, and probably now, I suspect Scholz doesn't want to create another rift between France and Germany because these are the most important countries in the European Union. Olaf Scholz agreed with interpretation of Macron against the background that the Germany uh, for Germany, this issue is very important. It's also important because Germany has not transferred and will not transfer to Ukraine, at least while Scholz is a chancellor, long range missiles or aircraft. And that's why here, in principle for Germany, it's only about artillery, howitzers, or apparently missiles for the RST air defense systems. That is, this is not such an important issue for Germany than the issue of the supply of Taurus missiles. That is why we see such a change in this position. Let's look at the dynamics of discussions of this issue in Germany. Unfortunately, we have a Germany in polls, and most Germans who are against the supply of Taurus missiles in Ukraine to Ukraine. This is somewhat of a very strange attitude because, on the other hand, the Germans are also in favor of their country helping Ukraine with weapons. That is, in principle, the Germans for supplying Ukraine with heavy weapons, but about these Taurus missiles. For some reason, the Germans believe that this will involve Germany in the war with Russia. So, so far, 11 countries have given Ukraine permission to use their weapons to strike targets in Russia. So, Poland's deputy defense minister, Cezary Tomczyk, said that his country has no objections to Ukraine using Polish weapons to hit targets in Russian territory. Similar permissions were also granted by Canada and Finland. Britain was one of the first to grant such permission to use weapons in Russian territory, and this position has since been supported by Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Czechia. In turn, as we all expected, Putin reacted to this by declaring that these representatives of NATO countries, especially in Europe, and should realize what they're playing with. But as we all know, Putin is bluffing as always, because there is no way, after 2 years, 2.5 years of war in Ukraine, when the Russian forces are very exhausted, there is no way that Putin can start the war with NATO allies. Thank you for listening. Ukraine will win this war, but it very heavily depends on the Western help Thank you. If you like my podcast, share with your friends.